Hey art nerds! Today I'm taking a look at some watercolor papers purchased from AliExpress. So these papers and the links were recommended by Maddie, who requested me to review these and give my feedback on them. And these are supposedly Coldpress Cottonrag watercolor papers. Originally I ordered things with 3 different covers and I was sent things with 2 of the same covers. So I sort of believe one of my listings might have been an old listing with old product and has since been updated. I will provide links to where you can get these over on AliExpress down in the description below. And unfortunately right now I do not currently have a price for you guys. So we have 3 pads, 2 of which seem to be the same. So I'm only going to take a look at one of these pads. But we have Acadmey watercolor paper. It is cold press. It also says it's 100% cotton and acid free. And it is made by Bao. The other is an interesting one. This is a watercolor round. They did have square and rectangular formats, but I was most interested in trying the round. And it is made by DorerArt. And it just has a watercolor pad, 300 grams, probably 20 sheets, and a 19 centimeter diameter. And there is actually no information on the back. So other than that, I don't really know too much about it. So today's review is going to be in 2 parts. We're actually going to do some comparative swatching on some watercolor papers that I'm very familiar with. And then we're going to do a couple of time lapses, or a couple of field tests in time lapse. And I may end up breaking this video up into a few different parts, kind of depending on how long this takes. And of course, by the end of this video, you guys will know how that's going. But I may break the field tests up into their own videos. We'll see how that goes. So the papers I'm going to do comparative swatches on are Fluid 100 Cottonrag paper and Arches watercolor paper. And I really just want to see how the paints handle. Now this is a block bound pad of Fluid 100. This is a tape bound pad of Arches, and these are both block bound watercolor pads. We're going to do our swatches with 2 different palettes. This is the Core Mini palette, which delivers really bright, saturated, vibrant color, but not necessarily a whole lot of granulation. And this is the Daniel Smith Ultimate Half Pan Mixing Set. And this set delivers a fair amount of granulation. So hopefully this will help us test a few different properties of these papers. So one of the first things I need to do is I need to go ahead and remove these from their plastic wrapping. Okay, so let's talk about the format. The DorerArt block has a plasticky cover on it, and I'm trying to see if I can lift it up or if it has been sealed all the way around. And it seems like most of... Okay, so this is our opening here in order to insert a palette knife, or in my case an X-Acto blade if necessary. Although it doesn't seem perhaps as strongly affixed. Now, aha, okay. Alright, I was grabbing 2 sheets instead of 1. This seems like I'm going to need a knife for this. So I will come back and do that in time lapse. This is our Acadmey watercolor pad. It has, oh, it's actually very similar in this regard to, say, Arches or the Blick watercolor pads, in that it has a protective sheet that we remove, and then it has a label telling us to open it from the top. This one is glued on all 4 sides with an opening at the top and a flip over cover. This one, it seems like it doesn't have like a flip over protective cover, so perhaps once we remove the cover we may be in danger of damaging the other sheets. So I'm going to go ahead and remove these 2 covers in time lapse. So you guys saw me really struggle to remove the DorerArt watercolor pad cover. I don't know why this is so difficult to remove, and I'm a little concerned that I damaged the next sheet, and I'm also kind of concerned that, like, if you were to travel with this, how would you protect the cover? I guess that's your problem now, right? So far, not a great first impression. However, the Acadmey watercolor paper pad, I like that it had the protective sheet. This was very easy for me to remove. And this seems to be gum bound, and that's going to be a little bit more difficult to remove, but I'm already used to that from other watercolor pads. So to me, it's not necessarily going to be any worse. So let's take a look. Hopefully you guys can see the texture on the paper. If not, you will be able to see the texture on the paper once we've added some watercolor, hopefully. This one here has a more even, more regular pattern of divots in the paper, or rather the texture is more regular. It reminds me kind of the surface of Strathmore watercolor paper. My preference is not watercolor papers that have a regular even texture. My preference is more this. There's a little bit more tooth to the paper. The texture isn't quite as even. This feels more like the Cottonrag watercolor papers that I'm used to. This feels more like a cellulose paper, but I know appearances can be deceiving, and really the only way to find out is to test them out. Arches, Fluid, Acadmey, DorerArt. Of the papers currently on the table, the Fluid Art has the least amount of texture. It is also only bound on two sides. The Arches paper, like we said, this is tape bound, so it's only bound at the top, but when you buy block bound Arches paper, it's bound on all four sides as well. This has much more texture, much more tooth to it, and I prefer, personally, I prefer Coldpress watercolor papers that have more texture. Fluid has a little bit less, but people who find themselves preferring hot press may enjoy the Fluid 100 cold press or the Fluid 100 hot press. These papers, this one, it doesn't seem as thickly glued along the edges as the Fluid, where it's just like a really thick dollop of glue, and the Acadmey seems to be a fairly thicker dollop of glue as well. So for the purposes of this sort of unbox and swatch sort of test, I'm going to move these just over to the side for now, and we're going to bring the camera down and really focus on these, and then when I'm doing the comparative swatches, I'll pull the camera back out so you guys can see the whole. I have several different brushes that I want to try using on these papers, but we're going to start with just color swatches using an angled flat, and we're going to start with the core. I'm going to put a little bit of water on these. I want to give them a chance to activate and allow the half pans to soak up some of this color. If you're interested in learning more about this palette, I have an unbox and swatch review as well as a Natosoup field test where I create an illustration using this palette. But the long and short of it is I really enjoy using this core palette. I highly recommend it, and I find that it performs quite well and delivers really bright, vivid colors. So if you're the sort of person who thinks watercolor can't be bright and vivid, this palette will prove you wrong. Alright, while that sort of soaks in, I'm going to do the same with the Daniel Smith Ultimate Mixing Half Pan palette, and I have an unbox and swatch review of this palette as well, and I also have a field test video so you guys can see if this is a good fit for you. I will say I don't enjoy this palette quite as much as I enjoy the core palette. I do enjoy using Daniel Smith watercolors, but I usually use them with other brands. And for me, using just Daniel Smith watercolors for the type of art I do, which is illustration and comics, it's just not quite the right fit. But that's my personal preferences. Your mileage most certainly may vary, and your experiences may very much differ from mine. So just adding a little bit of water to each pan. I apologize because my workspace is actually quite small for what it is. I'm just gonna have to get everything all out of order, but this way, hopefully you guys can see. So mostly what I'm looking for is just how the pigments sit on the paper and how they absorb into the paper. I'm looking to see if the colors get dull as they dry, and if the paper does indeed handle like a Coldpress Cottonrag watercolor paper. Now, I personally like Cottonrag papers for my art because, I mean, I do use cellulose papers. In fact, when I'm painting Cara pages, I'm using Canson Montval, which is a cellulose-based watercolor paper. But the reason I use that is it will run through my printer. It is economical for a project the scale of 7-inch Cara, which is hundreds of pages of watercolor comics. And I'm very familiar with it, and I know how to get it to do what I want it to do. When I'm doing illustrations, I usually grab a Cottonrag watercolor paper, whether it is fluid or arches. I also really like Blick Premier, but I didn't have any blocks that didn't have something else on them. And next, we are going to do swatches with the Daniel Smith palette. And I can actually move this over so you guys can see a little bit better. Grab the wrong color. So for me, just doing swatches on this paper is not going to be enough information for me to decide whether or not I like this paper. There's been watercolor papers that swatched really well and I didn't like painting on them, or it took finding the right paint for me to enjoy painting on it. So that is why I'm going to do the field test, and it's also why I'm kind of swatching two very different watercolors on this paper. And this rectangular block is available in a few different sizes. I ordered the smaller size because I thought I would be more likely to use it just for like everyday use. I do larger illustrations on occasion. The largest I usually work is like 14 by 11-ish, just because that kind of is in scale with my comic pages. And I don't really enjoy working too much larger than that. Maybe I should give it a try though. I feel like I work too tight, and if I worked larger, I could loosen up and do more freeing things. So in just a second, I will change the camera angle so you guys can see how these pigments look on the page. It's a little bit hard to see, so I'll try tilting it. There is enough texture on the paper that sedimentation can settle into the cracks and actually provide interesting results. Of course, the swatching took up so much of this paper, I'm going to have to remove it from the block for us to do some of our other testing, or I may have to open the other block. Either way. Alright, next we are going to do the DorerArt watercolor pad. Alright, so we are going to go back to the core palette. And this is really neat because we have a completely different format, and I'm not sure how I want to best take advantage of it for this test. To me, this paper feels a lot like Strathmore's 400 series cellulose watercolor paper. So it'll be really interesting to put this through some of its other tests. Now, one of the reasons cellulose paper might not be a good fit for you is with cotton rag paper, the pigments in the watercolor actually soak into the paper. You can do more layers, you can do more glazing. The paper itself can stay wet a little bit longer, so there's more effects that you can get. And I also think colors tend to look more vibrant on nice watercolor papers. I find that with cellulose papers, the colors sit on the surface of the paper. They're prone to lifting, they're prone to turning muddy. Colors also may appear more dull, and you may not be able to get as many layers on it. And the reason I keep talking about cellulose paper is I do have a suspicion that this is a cellulose paper. There was no information on the package itself as to whether it was cotton rag or cellulose. Kind of like when I reviewed those Arteza watercolor papers and I really had trouble finding in the original listing what the paper composition was. I believe the listing I purchased from on AliExpress said it was cotton rag paper, but I will have to do some digging and try to find that original listing. Now, I'm finding the paints seem like they're just sitting on the surface of the paper, which is another reason why I'm thinking this might be cellulose paper. All right. Next, we are going to do the Daniel Smith set on this paper. Now, I was really excited about round format watercolor papers, and I have another round format watercolor pad that I'm going to review soon for you guys. I really think this format could be beautiful for portraits, or perhaps commission portraits, friend portraits, personal portraits, pet portraits. Like, I just think the round format is very charming. Now, it's going to be a bear to frame. You probably would go with a square frame and then have matte all around, but just unusual formats can be really fun. They can be really freeing, and I look forward to introducing and playing with more unusual, strange formats here on the channel and in my personal art. And speaking of my personal art, if you would like to keep an eye on the kind of art that I'm making, you can head on over to Instagram at instagram.com/natosoup and check out my art over there. Yeah, it definitely seems like it's sitting on the surface of the paper. So I am moving this channel away from reviewing things that I think are intentionally bad, and I'm moving it more towards doing tutorials as well as reviews of products I think are good, worthwhile, worth your time, that sort of thing. So when I purchased these two pads, it was with someone else's recommendation. And I actually think I'm going to like the other pad. I'm not sure what's up with this one. It could just be, hey, it's cellulose and you just got to paint on it like you would cellulose paper. There's a time and a place for both. In fact, I do a lot of my cute con commissions on Fluid Easy Block, which is their cellulose paper. So I don't actually have a problem with cellulose. I just like knowing what it is before I start painting on it. Alright, so I'm going to change the angle of the camera so you guys can get a better view of the paint. Okay, so this is the DorerArt round watercolor block. Next, I'm going to do swatches on the Fluid 100 and the Arches watercolor paper. Next, I'm going to swatch on the Arches and then the Fluid 100. Now, since these are papers I'm already very familiar with and I work with frequently, I'm going to do that in time-lapse. I do have reviews for both Arches paper and Fluid 100 over at natosoup.blogspot.com in the Intro to Watercolor. Wait. No, I'm confusing two of my most popular series. My Watercolor Basics series hub page. And I will link that in the cards for you guys. Okay guys, so I have our swatches all done. Over here is the arches with the core at the top and the Daniel Smith down at the bottom. Then the fluid with the core at the top and the Daniel Smith at the bottom. Then the Acadmey with the core at the top and the Daniel Smith at the bottom. And then the DorerArt with the core at the top and the Daniel Smith at the bottom. I'm going to allow these to dry for a little while, and then I'm going to try doing lift tests. Okay friends, these have had a chance to dry, so I'm going to go over them with you guys one by one, and then we're going to try doing a lift test to see how well the papers, the fibers, hold on to the pigments. So this is our Fluid 100 watercolor paper. As you guys can see, it doesn't have a whole lot of texture to it. This is a fairly affordable cotton rag paper that could be a good first cotton rag paper for most users. Again, since there isn't a lot of tooth and the fibers seem to be very tightly compressed, the pigments don't really soak into the paper. This is a machine and mold made watercolor paper rather than a handmade watercolor paper, so the working properties might be a little bit different. This is the Arches cotton rag watercolor paper. Even though it is not block bound, it still holds its shape fairly well. All of these are, I believe, 140 pound or 300 GSM. This paper has much more surface texture, as I think you guys can see, and I feel that it does a better job of holding on to the colors and holding on to the pigments. Next is the DorerArt. I'm not super sure how to pronounce that. This is the one I think might be a cellulose paper, although there really isn't anything on the packaging to give that indication. There's not really anything on the paper to give that indication one way or the other. And then finally, we have the Acadmey pad. This one has a textured, maybe just a little less rough than the Arches watercolor paper, and I have pretty high hopes for this one. So next, let's go ahead and do the lift test. So for this lift test, I'm not actually trying to pick the pigments up off the paper, but I'm trying to see how prone they are to lifting and moving when another layer is applied. I have a cup of clean water over to the side and a fairly soft silver black velvet synthetic and squirrel round brush. So we're going to start with the Acadmey paper, and already it seems like it might be pretty prone to lifting because already the paint is moving around a fair bit. Now, you guys saw this was a fairly thick application, and I want to try not to make any snap judgments until we get a chance to do the full field test. Normally, I would not apply paint at this concentration and then try to do a glaze on top of it. I might use watercolor pencils or color pencils to add further details. So this isn't necessarily the most ideal use case scenario, but this will also kind of give us an opportunity to see how the paper handles, you know, more of a wash of color or a more diluted version of that color. While I wait for that to dry, I thought it could be fun to do a little bit of a gradiated wash over to the side. So I'm going to use the Core Magenta to give us kind of an opportunity to see what this paper has to offer a little bit. And then maybe I'll do The same using ultramarine blue, but smaller with the Daniel Smith set. And I'll just have them kind of flow into each other. We can see how the colors play on this paper. I'm going to set this aside, let this dry, and we're going to move on to some of our other papers. So this is the DorerArt watercolor paper. The one I think handles a bit like Strathmore 400 series cellulose paper. This one might be a little less prone to lifting than the Acadmey watercolor paper, but the Acadmey watercolor paper may not have fully dried. As I mentioned earlier in the video, cellulose papers are a little bit quicker to dry, in my experience, than cotton rag papers because the water doesn't really soak. Oh, okay, it is purple. It was sheening like a green. The water doesn't really soak into the fibers of a cellulose paper the way it would with a cotton rag paper, so they can be quicker to dry, which is again why we're going to do a few other tests with this, just to kind of get a feel for what this paper has to offer. And I think I'm going to do a similar gradient blend on this paper as well. So we have core magenta, and then we're going to do Daniel Smith ultramarine blue. And it really feels like everything's just kind of sitting on the surface. That could be a lot of surface sizing though. All right, I'm gonna put this to the side, let it dry. Take a look at our other two watercolor papers. All right, next I'm going to do the movement test on the Arches watercolor paper. And finally, I'm doing the lift test on the Fluid 100 watercolor paper. So I finished the lifting tests on all 4 of the different papers, and I also did a little bit of a wash test on the paper. And I feel like all 4 of these papers handle very differently. So I'm going to take you guys into a different camera angle and explain what I mean. So the first paper I did the swatch test with was the Acadmey watercolor paper. And I don't want to move it around too much, but I found that the pigments moved around a lot when I applied water to them. And I think part of the problem was that on some of these papers, perhaps things didn't have a chance to dry fully. It's a little bit damp outside, and as I mentioned earlier with cotton rag papers, they do tend to hold on to moisture a little bit longer. So they were quite prone to reactivating and the pigment redispersing. I do like the blend and the transition we were able to get with this paper. With the DorerArt watercolor round, I keep thinking this is going to be a cellulose paper, guys. I know I keep bringing it up. It really handles like a cellulose paper. You see how the water has pooled down here and kind of formed a divot, even though this is a block bound pad and it's a circle, so it's bound all the way around. Also, just sort of the way the pigments kind of move really strikes me as a cellulose based paper, or my experiences with other cellulose papers. And then the way this blended and the way it just seems to sit on the paper surface feels more like a cellulose based paper. Over here, way up in the corner, we have the Arches watercolor paper. And one of the reasons I went with Arches is that it's a paper that a lot of people are familiar with, or at least understand what the working properties of this paper are. We got a really smooth blend. We got some really nice granulation and wet into wet effects. Just generally, it handles the way I think of a cold press watercolor paper handling. And then we have the Fluid 100, which, as I mentioned before, is really very smooth textured for a cold press paper, and it tends to handle a little bit more like its hot press brethren, including how the pigments disperse and how they blend into each other. So I'm going to let these fully dry, and then we're going to do a little comparison of removing them from their blocks. Okay guys, so these have had a chance to dry. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and hold them up to the camera so you guys can kind of check them out yourselves. So this is the DorerArt watercolor pad. This is the Acadmey watercolor pad, watercolor block, I should say, since it's bound on all 4 sides with an opening at the top. This is the Fluid 100 watercolor block, which is only bound on 2 sides. And then finally, this is the Arches watercolor pad, which is only bound at the top. So next, we're going to remove these from their blocks, and we're going to talk about how difficult that is. Let's start with the DorerArt watercolor pad. Now, I know I saw an opening somewhere. But now I can't find it. Now, the fact that the glue is the same color, it's a clear glue, doesn't make this easy. Oh, you are very thin. And I can almost remove it with my ridiculously long witch's nail. In fact, I think if I am careful, I can. But if you don't have one ridiculously long nail for no good reason other than you're too lazy to cut your nails, then you probably can't use your nail to do this. But I bet you could use a palette knife, a butter knife, an X-Acto blade. This is actually not that difficult to remove. I have found that block bound Arches is the bane of my existence. It really does not want to come off using a palette knife, so I have to run an X-Acto blade around it. And the Fluid 100 pad is deceptively bad about tearing paper. So this is what the block looks like now that this has been removed, and you can see just a circle of watercolor paper. So this is fairly easy to remove from the block. Now we're going to take a look at removing the Acadmey art paper. Oh, that ain't gonna work. Okay, so I'm gonna use an X-Acto blade for this. I'm gonna use my nail to kind of separate it. and I'm just going to run the blade along the inside. Now this is a little hard for me to see because I'm kind of at an oblique angle, so you guys can see what's going on. So what I may do is I may have to do this off camera just so I can see what's going on a little bit better, although this might work. So how secure a block can hold its paper and how much I end up ruining a finished watercolor piece or the next page because a block is maybe too secure, those are important factors for me. I care more about the quality of the paper because I've gotten quite used to having to run an X-Acto blade along the edge, and I've gotten pretty good at that too. So I'm able to work with even difficult papers for the most part. That was like not wanting to come off, but now I think I got it. Almost. A little bit of curving, but in general, we were able to remove it without too much trouble. So that bodes fairly well. And the next thing I wish to do, I'm just gonna remove this really quick for you guys. So this is actually very thick watercolor paper. Now normally I bend it all the way up, which kind of helps. And sorry about that, didn't mean to hit the camera. And then finally, we have our, let me move these out of the way, our Fluid 100 pad. So I'm gonna demonstrate this, and I'm gonna try not to tear it, but because the glue is so thick, it usually does not want to come off cleanly. Okay, it's side A, flip it down. Ha! Okay, I was able to remove all of our watercolor paper with no real problems. So that is exciting because I did not expect that result. So the next thing I want to do is I'm going to throw, and I'm going to do this in time lapse. I'm going to throw a lot of paint, a lot of water onto these surfaces. I'm doing the mud test for those of you who remember some of my unbox and swatch videos. But I'm going to do the mud test, and we're just going to see how the paper reacts. So for the mud test, I'm going to be using Winsor and Newton paint from tubes, and I have a really cool comparative review series of Winsor and Newton, both comparing the tube watercolors to the half pan watercolors, as well as comparing the different watercolors manufactured by Coldpress/Winsor and Newton. So comparing Reeves, Cotman, and Winsor and Newton. If that sounds cool to you, you guys should check that out by clicking the cards here. So we are going to be using a silver black velvet brush as well as a sumi brush just to apply loads of water. I also have a synthetic quill here that I think will be quite useful in this. So the DorerArt starts to buckle with lots of water. Color tends to displace other color. The water pools towards the center of the paper, and the water tends to sit on the surface and it doesn't really sink in. The Acadmey buckles upward a smidge, but it doesn't ripple. Colors seem more vibrant on this paper. Color does not entirely displace prior color. Water sits on the surface, but it doesn't really pool. And then I sprinkled salt onto the surfaces to sort of just kind of test out just sort of how reactive it would be, because I have found that on Cottonrag paper, salt tends to leave a better reaction, and you guys will see that in a moment. So after I sprinkled the salt, I allowed it to dry, and my dry time started at 9:58. At 10:09, I checked again, and the Acadmey, the water was still on the surface, but it was starting to evaporate. The salt crystals left distinct snowflakes. On the DorerArt, the water was still pooled on the surface, and salt snowflakes were less apparent. So at 10:33, the Acadmey is almost entirely dry, only a few places are cool to the touch. DorerArt still has water pooled on it. At 10:39, both surfaces were dry and Acadmey was noticeably brighter, so I added a second layer of paint. I noticed that the colors are more saturated still on the Acadmey pad, even after drying, and the colors didn't really slough off or lift significantly on either pad. I expected the colors to pretty much slough off the DorerArt, but they stayed pretty securely on the paper. So once I applied that layer, I allowed it to dry, and my dry time started at 10:59. And you can see I'm trying to recreate techniques and use the same colors between the two pads so I can actually compare them. And I'm not attempting to make any art but mud here. So I sprinkled salt on again just to see if I could get any sort of interesting reaction. And at 10:59, I allowed it to dry. At 11:21, I checked it again, and it was pretty much fully dry, so I brushed off the excess salt, and with a synthetic flat brush and clean water, I tried to move the pigment around just to see how much had soaked into the surface and how prone this was going to be to turning into mud. I noticed you can really move pigment around kind of on both of them, but it is more prevalent on the DorerArt pad. It also happens with the softer Sumi brush, but not as much. And I find that the colors look muddier on the DorerArt paper. Okay guys, so these have had a chance to dry. I went over my thoughts with you guys during the time lapse. I am pretty sure this is cellulose base if I didn't make that really clear at the time. And I want you guys to notice, you guys saw I tried to do identical techniques between the two pads. The colors are much lighter and much more muddy on the DorerArt or DorerArt or DorerArt, I'm not even sure how to pronounce that, than they are on the Acadmey watercolor pad, which leads me to believe that the Acadmey watercolor pad is actual cotton rag, whereas this one over here is cellulose. Now that's not a reason not to buy it if you know that and you still want it, but it is something you should definitely be aware of and keep in mind when you're reading the listing on AliExpress or on Alibaba or even on Wish if that's where you see it. And just be aware that even if it says cotton rag, it doesn't behave like cotton rag. Could be cotton rag and just doesn't behave very well. But I hope that this was helpful for you guys and informative for you guys. I would buy this one again. There are other more accessible cotton rag watercolors that I can purchase here in the States that I don't have to wait 6 weeks to arrive. But this is decent cotton rag paper and I look forward to putting both of these to the field test. So now I'm going to remove our beautiful finished watercolor art from their respective pads. I'll get this one started with a knife. And I did 3 very wet layers of watercolor on these and 2 layers with salt just to kind of see, because I've noticed that salt crystals tend to handle, you get a better effect on on cotton rag paper, so I thought that would provide me some information. This pad held the paper really nice and taut. The glue seems to be, you know, doing its job, decent quality, up to the task. A little bit of a struggle to remove it from the block without using a knife for the entire thing, but you have your options. And this one is available in other sizes. Then we have this unusual creature here. This I have trouble finding the opening. Now, while I was painting, and I tried to demonstrate this for you guys, I noticed that the paper was buckling and rippling a fair amount, even though this is pad bound on almost infinite sides. We do have one opening, but it's a circle, and it's pad bound almost all the way, or glue bound almost all the way around said circle. And we still have buckling issues, and you would think this would be the most secure kind of block. Oh my goodness, what did I do? Give me a sec, let me fix this. Got it. Did end up cutting into the page a little bit. So these are our resulting watercolors for your reference. Okay guys, so I paid $12.79 for the round watercolor pad, and I paid about $7.48 for the small, possibly Cottonrag watercolor pad, and I will link those for you guys down in the description below. And this also includes, or rather you should add on shipping to your address. And on AliExpress, sometimes shipping is what can make these things really expensive. So this pad, I don't believe that this is Cottonrag paper. Not necessarily seeing a whole lot of additional info about that. This pad here, I do believe it's Cottonrag paper, and it says it's Cottonrag paper on it. And there are other styles available as well as other sizes. And this is the cover I thought I was ordering. That's why I ordered 2 different types. And it's available in 3 finishes: fine grain, medium grain, and coarse grain. And I was actually pretty satisfied with the quality for this one. So how did these 2 watercolor pads from AliExpress compare to some of the brands that are more commonly available in the US? Well, I found that the Acadmey watercolor paper isn't bad at all. Liked it pretty decently well. Of course, we are going to have to do a full field test to be able to decide how well this paper actually performs. If I saw it in a store and I thought the price was fair, I would definitely buy it again, at least based on this initial test. Colors are vibrant, you're able to layer on it. It seems to actually be Cottonrag paper, seems to handle paint quite normally. The round DorerArt, not really sure which one. I am pretty sure this is cellulose paper, and while there isn't necessarily anything wrong with cellulose paper, you just want to know that when you're buying it. You don't want to think you're getting Cottonrag when you're getting cellulose paper. The format is really interesting, but it is not the only round watercolor pad on the market. I have another review, another comparison video very similar to this one coming up with a different brand that I purchased from David's Art Supply a while back. So I look forward to diving into that one, and I hope it performs better than this. I felt like it was kind of disappointing. I don't like the paper texture all that much, and I don't know. I'm gonna use it. It's not like so bad that I wouldn't use it, but it wasn't what I was expecting. And I was really hoping for it to be Cottonrag paper, and $12 for 20 sheets at this size. It could be Cottonrag, it could also not be Cottonrag, you know. I find it very similar to the Strathmore 400 series cellulose paper, the one with the brown cover, and that's one of my least favorite watercolor papers. So I definitely plan on using this pad up, and I look forward to sharing that with you guys. But I would not recommend you get this pad. I would recommend you buy other circular watercolor pads that are on the market. So that about wraps up another unbox and swatch watercolor field test. I don't normally review paper this way, but I thought this could be a more accessible way to start working through some of my watercolor paper collection and sharing some of my finds with you guys. I hope you guys found this helpful, useful, and informative. I will have a transcript of some of what was covered in this video down in the description below, as well as links to where you can buy these over on AliExpress. I do not have any sort of affiliate status with AliExpress. So if you like what I do and you want to help me continue to do it, you can join me over on Patreon at patreon.com/natosoup. And of course, Bowie would think this is an awesome time to go use the litter box because that is my cat. But he held it for the duration of this video, so I gotta give him some credit there. Anyway, I want to thank you guys so much for watching. If you're looking for more watercolor content, make sure you check out my watercolor basics playlist here on this channel, particularly if you are interested in learning how to watercolor. I also have a great watercolor basics series in written form over on my blog at natosoup.blogspot.com. I can't wait to see you guys again, and please keep an eye out for field tests for both of these pads. Bye guys!